Why is it that we spend so much energy trying to convince others of our worth, only to find ourselves even more exhausted and further from connection? You've probably been there, carefully crafting arguments, presenting your case, and working overtime to prove yourself to someone you care about. And somehow, despite all that effort, you end up feeling more disconnected than before. Think about the last time you really wanted someone to see your value. Maybe it was a potential partner, a crush, or even someone you're already in a relationship with. You likely found yourself in that familiar cycle, trying harder, talking more, and becoming increasingly frustrated when your efforts didn't translate to the connection you were hoping for. The truth is, this approach isn't just ineffective, it's actively working against you. When we focus all our energy on convincing someone else of our worth, we inadvertently signal that we don't fully believe in it ourselves. We place our value in their hands, giving them the power to validate or invalidate who we are. And in that process, we often lose sight of the very qualities that make us attractive in the first place. What if I told you that the solution isn't to try harder, but to shift your focus entirely? What if the key to having someone recognize your value isn't about convincing them at all, but rather creating the space for them to discover it on their own? This isn't about playing games or using manipulation tactics. It's about understanding a fundamental truth of human psychology. We value what we discover for ourselves far more than what others tell us to value. When someone feels they've made their own choice, when they've reached their own conclusion about your worth, that belief becomes infinitely more powerful than anything you could have told them. So, how do we make this shift? How do we stop the exhausting cycle of trying to convince others and instead create the conditions for them to convince themselves? First, we need to understand what's really happening when we fall into the convincing trap. When you're constantly trying to prove yourself to someone, you're operating from a place of scarcity and fear. You're implicitly telling both yourself and the other person that you don't believe you're enough as you are. This creates a subtle but powerful dynamic where you're chasing validation, and they're in the position of either granting or withholding it. Think about how this feels from the other person's perspective. When someone is working overtime to convince you of something, what's your natural reaction? For most of us, it triggers resistance. We feel pressured, and that pressure creates a natural pushback. The harder someone tries to convince us, the more we tend to retreat into our own position. It's human nature. This is why the traditional approach of trying to prove yourself is fundamentally flawed. The more you try to convince someone of your value, the more likely they are to question it. The harder you push, the stronger their resistance becomes. So what's the alternative? It starts with a fundamental shift in your mindset and actions. Instead of focusing on proving your worth, focus on embodying it. When you truly believe in your own value, you don't need constant external validation. You can show up authentically without the desperate energy of someone seeking approval. This quiet confidence is magnetic in a way that trying to convince someone can never be. Redirect your energy toward your own growth and fulfillment. What lights you up? What challenges you? What makes you feel alive and engaged with life? When you pursue these things for your own sake, not to impress someone else, you naturally become more attractive. You develop the kind of genuine passion and purpose that draws others in rather than pushing them away with neediness. Create space in the relationship. When you're constantly trying to convince someone, you're filling all the available space with your energy and agenda. There's no room for the other person to step forward, to discover things about you on their own, or to miss your presence. By stepping back and creating some breathing room, you allow curiosity to develop. You give them the chance to wonder about you, to notice the gap when you're not there, and to actually want to close that distance themselves. Focus on authentic connection rather than approval. Instead of trying to say the right things to impress her, be genuinely curious about who she is. Ask questions that come from a place of real interest, not strategy. When you shift from self-focused anxiety about being enough to genuine curiosity about another person, the entire dynamic changes. You're no longer the salesperson pitching your worth. You're two humans exploring a potential connection. Demonstrate value through actions, not words. Rather than telling her how caring, ambitious, or funny you are, simply be those things. Let her witness your character through how you treat others, how you pursue your goals, and how you move through the world. These demonstrations speak volumes more than any self-promotion ever could. Practice healthy boundaries. Nothing communicates self-worth more clearly than having standards for how you want to be treated. When you don't accept disrespect or inconsideration, you signal to both yourself and others that you value yourself. Ironically, this self-respect makes others more likely to respect and value you as well. Embrace vulnerability from a place of strength. There's a profound difference between vulnerability that comes from insecurity, please see my value, and vulnerability that comes from self-confidence, this is who I am, take it or leave it. The former repels, the latter attracts. When you can share your thoughts, feelings, and quirks without needing a specific response, you create the opportunity for real connection. Remember, the goal isn't to become indifferent or aloof. It's to operate from a centered place where your sense of self isn't dependent on any one person's opinion of you. From this foundation, you can engage with others authentically, without the desperate energy that comes from needing validation. When you make this shift, something remarkable happens. The very person you were trying so hard to convince often begins to see you in a new light. Without the pressure of your expectations and need for approval, they're free to discover your qualities on their own terms. And as we've established, what we discover for ourselves is infinitely more compelling than what others try to convince us of. This is the beautiful paradox. When you stop trying to convince her of your worth and instead focus on embodying it, she becomes much more likely to recognize it herself. When you release the need for her validation and instead live from your own sense of value, you become naturally more attractive. When you create space instead of filling it with desperate energy, you create the conditions for genuine connection to develop. Think about it. The relationships that have meant the most to you in your life, weren't they the ones where you felt truly seen and appreciated for who you are? Where you didn't have to constantly prove yourself or maintain a carefully crafted image? That's the kind of connection that becomes possible when you stop trying to convince and start embodying your worth. This isn't a quick fix or a manipulation tactic. It's a fundamental shift in how you relate to yourself and others. It requires patience, self-awareness, and a willingness to sit with the discomfort of not knowing how someone else feels about you. But the freedom and authenticity it brings are worth every moment of that discomfort. So the next time you find yourself caught in the cycle of trying to convince someone of your worth, whether it's a potential partner, a crush, or someone you're already in a relationship with, pause, take a deep breath, remind yourself that your value isn't determined by their recognition of it. Then shift your focus back to living from that value rather than seeking validation for it. The truth is, the most compelling argument for your worth isn't an argument at all. It's the quiet confidence that comes from knowing your value, regardless of whether anyone else recognizes it in the moment. It's the authentic engagement with your own life that naturally draws others towards you. It's the space you create that allows someone else to step forward and discover you on their own terms. Stop trying to convince her. Instead, create the conditions where she can convince herself. In that space, free from pressure, expectation, and desperate energy, real connection becomes possible. And ironically, it's only when you no longer need her validation that she becomes most likely to freely give it. This isn't just about dating or romantic relationships. It's about a fundamentally healthier way to move through the world. When you anchor your sense of worth from within, rather than seeking it from others, every relationship in your life transforms. You show up differently, more authentic, more centered, more present. And that version of you is infinitely more attractive than the one desperately seeking approval could ever be. So take that first step. Release the need to convince. Trust in your inherent value. Create the space for others to discover it. And watch as the very validation you were chasing begins to flow towards you naturally, without effort or struggle.